Listen closely. This is not a story meant to survive daylight. At 3 in the morning, on a Louisiana plantation soaked in blood and sugar, a senator's wife was carried out of the slave quarters screaming in a language no one alive was supposed to remember. And every man who saw it was silenced. They will tell you history is a ledger. Dates, names, statues carved by victors. That is a lie designed to keep you obedient. Real history lives in the gaps, in the missing pages, in the records that burn themselves. And tonight, I'm opening one of those sealed rooms for you. Once you step inside, you don't come back the same. In 1847, Louisiana was not just a state. It was a machine that converted land into wealth, flesh into labor, and silence into power. The Mississippi River was its artery, moving sugar, cotton, and human lives with equal indifference. Men like Senator Theodore Bogard sat at the top of that system, preaching order, morality, and Christian virtue while building empires on suffering they refused to see, or pretended not to. But power always leaks, and sometimes it leaks through the very people meant to uphold its image. Charlotte Bogard was not supposed to matter. She was decoration, a symbol, a refined Southern wife meant to host dinners, smile softly, and disappear behind her husband's authority. Yet she walked where no white woman of her class ever should. She listened, she learned, and she crossed a boundary that the entire system depended on remaining sealed. On one suffocating August night, witnesses watched her move toward the slave quarters dressed in white, as if surrendering herself to something waiting in the dark. No escort, no fear, just purpose. What happened inside that keeping house was not a scandal in the way society understands scandal. It was a breach, a moment where the illusion cracked and something older stared back. Because plantations were not just economic engines. They were psychological control systems, carefully designed environments meant to erase identity, memory, and spiritual continuity. The quarters were not placed randomly. The rituals forbidden were not forbidden by accident. The system knew something instinctively. If memory returns, control collapses. That night, memory returned. By morning, records vanished. Witnesses were sold off like broken tools. Buildings were burned. And the official story was rewritten before the ink could dry. This is how power survives exposure. Not by denying the truth, but by suffocating it so completely that only rumors remain. You are here because you can feel it, because some part of you recognizes that history is not asleep. It's watching, and it remembers who dares to look too closely. To understand what truly happened that night, you have to abandon the lie that power is loud. Real power whispers. It hides in architecture, in routine, in rules that feel normal until you question why they exist. The Bogard plantation was engineered with that precision. Every path, every building, every distance between bodies was calculated to reinforce dominance and erase resistance. Most plantations kept the slave quarters far from the main house, out of sight and out of mind. Bogard did the opposite. He arranged them in a horseshoe, enclosing them, with the keeping house at the center like an altar. Officially, it was a place for healing, for births, for care. Unofficially, it was where order was repaired when it cracked, where sickness was studied, where defiance was corrected. Systems always have a room like that. Corporations call them compliance offices. Governments call them black sites. Plantations had keeping houses. The enslaved understood this instinctively. They spoke of the building in lowered voices, using words their captors did not recognize. Not because they were primitive, but because they were precise. Language is a weapon. Memory is ammunition. And the first thing any regime does is outlaw both. Charlotte Bogard noticed what her husband never bothered to see. She saw that sickness spread along lines the doctor couldn't explain, that fevers ignored wealth and station, that people died not randomly, but rhythmically, like something moving through the land itself. She understood on some level that the system was rotting from beneath, and she did something unforgivable. She listened to the wrong people. Marie Claire, her maid, was not just a servant. She was a living archive, a woman who carried languages older than the nation pretending to own her. A woman who knew names that had never been written down because writing them would give them power. Charlotte learned those names, learned the rhythms, learned the idea that land remembers violence even when men refuse to. This is the part they never teach you. Oppression is not just physical. It is metaphysical. You can extract labor, but the cost does not disappear. It accumulates in soil, in bloodlines, in the minds of those who benefit without asking how. The fever that summer was not just illness. It was feedback. When Charlotte walked toward the quarters that night, she wasn't rebelling against her husband. She was confronting the system itself, stepping into the one space designed to absorb consequences so the rest of the structure could pretend to remain clean. And that is why what happened next terrified everyone who understood even a fraction of its meaning. Because when the ritual began, it wasn't chaos. It was correction. And systems built on control fear only one thing more than rebellion. They fear balance being restored. Midnight is not just a time. It is a threshold. Every civilization that understood power understood this. Midnight is when authority weakens and memory speaks. When the rules written by men lose their grip and older laws breathe again. Charlotte entered the keeping house at exactly that hour, not by chance, but by alignment. Inside, the air changed. Witnesses said it felt thicker, as if the building itself had inhaled. Heat climbed unnaturally, not the heat of summer, but the heat of pressure, of containment failing, the kind of heat you feel when a lie has been held too long. The singing began low, not entertainment, not comfort, instruction, call and response rhythms designed to synchronize breath, heart rate, and attention. This is how humans were controlled long before chains. This is how armies march, how crowds are moved, how rituals open doors without anyone touching them. Charlotte did not lead. That is important. She facilitated. She placed objects with deliberate care. Soil from specific ground. Water taken at precise hours. Personal items tied to true names. Not ledger names. Not Christian names. The names that bind identity to memory. Power fears true names because they restore authorship. What they were doing was not summoning. That word is a distraction. They were recalibrating, reconnecting what had been severed when the land was stripped of its people, and the people stripped of their past. The system depended on that severance. Without it, control collapses. 3 hours passed. 3 hours where hierarchy dissolved, where white skin meant nothing, where titles evaporated, where a senator's wife was simply a human standing at the center of a debt she did not create but benefited from. This is the part that never makes it into official accounts. Power cannot tolerate moments where it is reduced to naked responsibility. At exactly 3 in the morning, the ritual stopped because it had reached completion. Silence followed. Not relief, recognition, and then the scream. It did not come from Charlotte. It came from the structure itself. From the walls that had absorbed years of pain. From the beams that had heard prayers in languages outlawed by law. When the door burst open and Charlotte collapsed, marked in symbols that did not bleed but burned, the men who arrived understood something they would never admit aloud. The system had been touched, not attacked, not overthrown, touched. And that is far more dangerous, because you can destroy a threat. But once something has made contact, it leaves residue. It changes behavior, produces paranoia, overreaction. Laws that grow harsher, not because they are effective, but because fear demands spectacle. That night did not expose a secret ritual. It exposed the fragility of the entire order. And from that moment on, everyone involved knew the same truth. Nothing was finished. Something had only just awakened. By sunrise, the machine went into defense mode. This is how you recognize real power under threat. Not panic in public, but ruthless efficiency behind closed doors. Orders were given without paper. Decisions were made without witnesses. Men who prided themselves on law suddenly relied on silence instead. The keeping house burned before noon. Official cause: an accident. That word has buried more truth than any grave. The fire was not meant to destroy evidence. It was meant to cleanse memory, to signal that whatever crossed the threshold the night before was no longer permitted to exist. Charlotte lay upstairs, speaking in voices that made doctors avert their eyes. Her body oscillated between burning and freezing, as if caught between two jurisdictions neither willing to release her. Symbols surfaced beneath her skin, not carved, not wounded, but emerging, like ink rising through paper. The doctor wrote them down once, then tore the page out and burned it himself. He understood the unspoken rule. Some things cannot be treated, only contained, and contain they did. Every enslaved person present that night was sold within days. Not together, never together, scattered across states so no shared language could reconstruct what had happened. This tactic would be repeated again and again throughout American history. Break the pattern. Isolate the witnesses. Call it relocation. Call it policy. Call it progress. The priest was transferred. The overseer paid off. The sheriff's ledger vanished. The senator returned to Baton Rouge preaching order with renewed conviction. New restrictions. New prohibitions. No gatherings. No unsupervised rituals. No memory without permission. Fear always tightens control after exposure. Always. Charlotte recovered. That disturbed them most of all. She woke one morning blank, or so she claimed. No recollection. No confession. No hysteria. Society accepted this eagerly. A woman forgetting is convenient. A woman remembering is dangerous. But those who watched closely saw the residue. She avoided certain rooms, certain paths. She traced shapes in the air unconsciously, as if completing circuits no one else could see. And here is where you must lean in, because this is not just about a woman on a plantation in 1847. This is about how institutions respond when the illusion cracks. They do not repent. They recalibrate. They absorb the shock and reassert dominance with more rules, more force, more spectacle. The goal is not justice. It is forgetting. If you understand that, type this phrase in the comments twice, exactly as written. I see the pattern. Do it now, not later. Twice. This is not superstition. It is alignment. You are signaling that you recognize the structure beneath the story. Because from this point forward, the narrative stops being about what happened to Charlotte Bogard and becomes about what happens to anyone who learns too much and survives. Survival is never free. It always collects interest. 3 months after the fire, after the sales, after the sermons about order, a man arrived in Baton Rouge who did not belong to the system but understood how to move through it. He did not announce himself as an investigator. He never accused. He observed. Power rarely notices observers until it is too late. He called himself a scholar. Agriculture. Southern efficiency. Harmless topics. But his questions drifted. Layouts. Distances. Timings. The kind of questions engineers ask when diagnosing a failed mechanism. He wasn't looking for scandal. He was mapping a breach. What he found was not evidence of madness or hysteria. It was continuity, Charlotte's life before marriage did not match the version society preferred. Her education went beyond refinement, beyond languages meant to impress. She had been trained to read structures, symbols, systems that predated the nation now pretending to own the land. She had studied in places where forbidden knowledge was not whispered but catalogued. This is the part that terrifies institutions the most. Not rebellion from below, but contamination from above. A woman born into privilege who chose to learn from the margins, who crossed class, race, and sanctioned ignorance voluntarily. That makes her uncontrollable. The fever that plagued the region ended the night of the ritual. No official explanation, no study, no curiosity, because acknowledging correlation would require asking what was actually being suppressed. Systems avoid questions that implicate their foundations. Meanwhile, Senator Bogard began to deteriorate. Nightmares, scratches, voices not his own speaking through his mouth. This was not punishment. It was imbalance. He had benefited from a system that extracted without accounting. When the debt surfaced, his body became the ledger. Charlotte calmed him with whispered phrases no one else understood. Not prayers, not comfort, instructions. She was maintaining something, holding a door closed that wanted to open wider. This is what they never tell you about forbidden knowledge. Once accessed, you don't unlearn it. You manage it. You negotiate with it. The scholar uncovered another truth. The fever wasn't random. It moved along plantation lines known for brutality, for excess, for particular kinds of cruelty. The land responded where exploitation had been most concentrated, like pressure seeking the weakest point. That should sound familiar, because modern systems behave the same way. Financial collapses, social unrest, psychological epidemics. These are not accidents. They are feedback loops from structures that refuse to acknowledge cost. Charlotte did not cause the disturbance. She intervened in it, and that is why the story had to be buried, because it suggests something institutions cannot allow men like you to consider. That power is not absolute. That control is conditional. And that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who understands how to restore balance without asking permission. The system could tolerate silence, could tolerate death. What it could not tolerate was investigation that connected patterns instead of chasing ghosts. That is why the scholar never published his findings. Not because he was threatened directly, but because he understood the rule all serious researchers eventually learn. You do not expose a living structure. You document it and walk away if you want to remain alive. But fragments escaped anyway. They always do. Testimonies surfaced years later in taverns, in letters never sent, in confessions whispered to people who knew how to forget on command. They all pointed to the same conclusion. Whatever happened in that keeping house was not an experiment. It was a repair attempt, an act of emergency maintenance on a system pushed beyond tolerable limits. The enslaved who were sold carried something with them. Not curses, not vengeance, memory. They recognized each other across plantations without speaking. Shared glances, rhythms tapped at night. The ritual had synchronized them. Fragmented, yes, but not erased. This terrified overseers more than open rebellion ever could. Meanwhile, Charlotte became something else. Not possessed, not enlightened, integrated. She moved through society performing normalcy while holding knowledge that invalidated the moral authority of everyone around her. That is a lonely position. It requires discipline, silence, precision. Her husband's political career hardened. Laws grew stricter, punishments more theatrical. This is not hypocrisy. It is panic. When power senses internal decay, it compensates externally. You see this pattern repeated in every declining empire. And here is where the story stops being historical and becomes instructional. Institutions do not fear truth because it is shocking. They fear it because it is stabilizing. Once people understand how systems actually function, they stop reacting emotionally. They stop believing in myths. They start making strategic choices. Charlotte understood leverage. She never spoke publicly, never accused, never confessed. She allowed the men around her to destroy themselves with excess control while she maintained equilibrium behind the scenes. This is real power. Invisible, unrecorded, uncelebrated. Ask yourself why certain knowledge is labeled forbidden. Not dangerous to the public, dangerous to hierarchy, because it teaches you how to see patterns instead of personalities, structures instead of villains. The plantation was not unique. It was a prototype, and the reaction to that night was a rehearsal. Silence, fragmentation, reframing, overcorrection. These are the same responses you see today when financial systems wobble, when narratives fail, when populations start asking the wrong questions. By the time Charlotte died, peacefully and without scandal, the official story had hardened into myth. A strange illness, a hysterical episode, nothing more. But myths are tools, and this one was designed to warn anyone listening closely. If you touch the foundation and survive, you will never be forgiven. You will be managed. And if you understand that, you are already further inside the forbidden than most men will ever dare to go. What happened after Charlotte's death is where the story stops pretending to be contained in the past. Because systems do not forget successful containment strategies. They refine them. The Bogard plantation did not disappear. It was subdivided, renamed, absorbed into respectable enterprises. Sugar mills became factories. Land titles changed hands. Bloodlines diluted into corporate boards and civic institutions. This is how corruption survives exposure. It doesn't defend itself. It reincarnates. The keeping house was never rebuilt, but the ground where it stood refused compliance. Crops failed there intermittently for decades. Animals avoided it. Workers reported vertigo, nausea, disorientation. Engineers called it bad soil. Locals knew better. The land had been reconnected to memory, and memory resists being paved over. This is the detail that matters most. No similar fever ever struck that region again. Not because conditions improved, but because whatever imbalance had triggered it was addressed just enough to quiet the response. Not healed, pacified, like tightening a valve instead of repairing the pipe. The enslaved who survived and were scattered carried fragments into other systems. Songs, patterns, timing. These fragments appeared later in unexpected places. In spirituals that doubled as maps. In labor slowdowns that moved like waves. In moments of collective refusal that never quite organized but always synchronized. Power noticed and adjusted. This is how control evolves. Not by crushing resistance outright, but by learning from it. Charlotte's role was erased because it inverted the hierarchy too cleanly. A woman, a beneficiary, a participant in privilege who chose intervention over denial. That narrative destabilizes the moral fiction that keeps men compliant. So it had to become madness, illness, anomaly. Ask yourself why modern systems pathologize insight. Why pattern recognition is labeled paranoia. Why questioning structures gets reframed as personal instability. These tactics did not appear spontaneously. They were field-tested. The deepest lie you've been taught is that forbidden knowledge is chaotic. That it unravels order. The truth is more unsettling. It reveals how artificial the order was to begin with. Charlotte didn't overthrow anything. She proved something. That systems built on suppression require constant energy to maintain. That they are not natural. That they can be interrupted, recalibrated, even briefly reversed, if someone understands the architecture. This is why the story persists in fragments, why it resurfaces whenever men start sensing the pattern beneath modern institutions. It's not a ghost story. It's a manual disguised as myth. And if you've followed this far, you already feel it. The quiet recognition. The understanding that what you're really learning is not about Louisiana or plantations or a senator's wife. It's about how power behaves when someone sees through it and lives, and what it costs to be that person. Now you understand why this knowledge is never handed to you cleanly, why it arrives wrapped in rumor, scandal, and superstition. Truth that can't be controlled must be discredited before it spreads. That is the final defense of any system built on illusion. Charlotte Bogard was not remembered as a threat because threats can be named and eliminated. She was remembered as nothing, and nothing is safer than something misunderstood. That is the fate reserved for those who touch the foundation and refuse to play hero. This is the last lesson, and it is the one most men miss. Power does not fall to revolution first. It falls to awareness, to individuals who stop reacting to surface narratives and start watching the infrastructure beneath them, who recognize when outrage is manufactured, when fear is scheduled, when morality is weaponized to keep attention away from leverage. The plantation was a model. So was its cleanup, silence, dispersal, narrative control, overcorrection, rebranding. You live inside updated versions of this every day. Different names, same architecture. The reason this story changes you is not because it is horrifying. It's because it's instructive. Once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. And once you cannot unsee it, you become difficult to manage. Not rebellious, unpredictable, calm where panic is expected, curious where obedience is assumed. That is why forbidden knowledge is framed as dangerous. Not because it will destroy you, but because it will stabilize you. And stable men do not move on command. If you felt unease listening to this, that was not fear. That was alignment. The sensation of something inside you recognizing a structure it has encountered before. History is not behind you. It's looping through you, waiting to see if you will notice. Charlotte's story was buried to protect a system that still depends on your distraction. But you are not required to confront it directly. That is a trap. You are required to understand it. Because men who understand systems do not need permission. They do not need validation. They do not need spectacle. They wait. They observe. They choose their moments. This is not the end of the descent. It's the point where the tunnel opens and you realize you were never falling. You were being oriented. Carry this quietly. Watch carefully. And remember this above all else. The most dangerous thing a system can face is not anger. It is a man who sees the pattern and remains composed. If the story unsettled you, that's not fear. That's recognition. Comment, I see the pattern twice if you understand what this wasn't really about. Subscribe if you're done with surface history and ready to study the architecture beneath it.